Okay, so greetings, everybody. Welcome. It's a Thursday afternoon or morning, or maybe even evening, depending where on the globe you are. And this is a global issue about the future of energy efficiency in buildings. I'm David Nemso. I'm with the U.S. Department of Energy. I'm with the DOE Loan Programs Office, responsible for our initiative on virtual power plants. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I commissioned this work in my previous position at US DOE as Director of the Building Technologies Office. And when I first talked to Steve Schiller and to Marianne Piet and Lisa Schwartz and the Jeff Deese and the other folks at Berkeley Lab, we wanted to take advantage of the knowledge. And I'll quote my boss, Jigar Shah, who just said, we need people in our office who have scars, not just bright young things, but people who've been in battle in our field. And so that's why we asked Steve and his team at Berkeley Lab to take on this work about the future of energy efficiency in buildings so that we could think about the big, broad perspectives that this essential issue has, but also we wanted people who were practical and who had been practitioners in the field and not unduly naive or unduly Pollyannish, hence Steve Schiller. So I am going to turn it over to you, Steve, for some practical things. And then we have just a superb panel of stakeholders who can discuss these issues. And we're going to look forward to the future of efficiency in buildings. But first, Steve, why don't you get us started and tell us about your research?
Thank you very much, David. And welcome, everybody. It's great to see so many names of many colleagues here. We have a lot to cover and some great panelists, as David mentioned, to provide their perspective. So I'm going to charge right in here with about a 10-minute or so whirlwind tour of our research project on the future of efficiency for buildings. And then we're going to get to our panelists to have a discussion. If you have questions, please put them into the Q&A box there. We're going to plan on doing questions at the very end, probably at the top of the hour. But if there's, please put your questions in as you think of them. And for some of them, we might be able to answer on the fly directly to you through the Q&A box. And as David mentioned, this is being recorded. The slides, the report, the recording of this will be available on a website that you'll see in the chat box. So next slide, please. So here is the obligatory disclaimer, but also a shout out to our funder, the Department of Energy's Building Technology Office, and our DOE managers, Monica Newcomb and David, who you've just heard from. I also want to do a shout out to my co-authors and all the professionals whose publications and participation in our interviews questionnaire really made this work possible. And then quickly on the top left here, I just want to mention that with DOE funding, the Berkeley Lab provides free technical assistance for public agencies on a wide range of energy topics, including efficiency. For those who might be interested in that technical assistance, you can contact any of the people listed. And again, these slides will be available. Next slide, please, Kristen.
And Steve, let's just say it, you'd be crazy not to take Berkeley Lab up on that offer. I'm just going to say it that way. You get great TA, whether you're a PUC, a state energy office, or any other state player.
Okay. Thanks, David. Happy to serve. So we're going to cover quickly in this whirlwind tour is the scope on the approach to the work, what we found out about drivers of the efficiency markets, some future attributes of efficiency markets, as well as some implications. And so this is a quick summary, and of course I want to refer you to the actual report, which is a much more comprehensive presentation deck that is available on the website. You'll find again in the chat box, as well as this recording. We also have an ACEEE summer study paper coming up on this as well. Next slide, please. So turning to the scope and approach, our focus of this work was efficiency for the built environment, buildings, and for all fuels. Other distributed energy resources, DERs, as well as decarbonization and demand flexibility were included to the extent they are intertwined with efficiency activities. And the primary objective was to identify drivers, that is, influencing factors of energy efficiency in buildings over the next 10 years, with a secondary objective to provide insights on what the future efficiency might look like. This is a secondary objective because we recognize while the future is hard to predict, its drivers can be more readily identified. And the way we did this was with a review of nearly 100 documents, from academic papers to government publications to even blog posts. With the help of the firm E9 Insights, we reviewed regulatory, executive, and legislative demand side management activities in 12 states. Then Greg Leventis from the Berkeley Lab and myself interviewed 21 experts in efficiency and energy markets from industry, utilities, research groups, academia. And then we followed that up with an extensive questionnaire that was completed by 41 efficiency practitioners. And then we tried to pull it all together. Next slide, please. So why do we do this? Why is it important? Well, David kind of covered this, so I'll just mention, buildings use a lot of the energy, cost a lot of the money we spend in this country, and a lot of that's wasted. And understanding these drivers can really help in making informed decisions for whatever direction policymakers and others want this efficiency market to move. Next slide, please. So I know the suspense is really killing you, but here they are, the 6 categories of drivers we identified and are shown here. And these are all interrelated and overlapping factors that are define the attributes of the efficiency markets for buildings. What do I mean by attributes of efficiency markets? Well, who are the buyers and sellers? Where are their products and services? The affected end uses in buildings. What are the delivery mechanisms for delivering these products and services? And what's the integration and interaction of efficiency with other DERs? And of course, the scale of the market, how many dollars, how many units of energy are saved. So what we found is that efficiency in buildings does not have a singular future. Instead, its attributes will vary across different jurisdictions and market sectors like residential, low income, urban, rural. And these attributes will be driven primarily by the unique characteristics of each of those sectors and by these drivers. There's 2 that we found to be likely to be very important, and that's energy and climate policies and regulations. And secondly, the cost of energy to consumers. And then 3 drivers that are likely to be important: technology advances, economic conditions, and social priorities. And then 1 driver that I consider to be potentially important: business practices for increasing the uptake of efficiency in buildings. Next slide, please. Some points on the 2 major drivers are shown here. First, the 2 graphics show the responses we got to our questionnaire. And I want to mention about the questionnaire, the responses we got were pretty well backed up by our interviews, but the survey wasn't everybody and it's not a scientific sample, but the message was pretty clear. These 2 drivers are really important: public policy and regulation at the federal, state, and local level. For example, building economy-wide decarbonization and performance-based regulations for utilities. And then the cost of energy consumers and the rate structures, fixed versus variable prices, for example. And this is relative to the cost of implementing efficiency actions and other options to reduce energy costs. On the costs, I suppose you could say basic economics of supply and demand really do matter. But also, as many of you know who work in the field, the value of non-energy benefits is also important. Comfort, asset value, bragging rights, and these can actually make the sale for efficiency. Next slide, please. On the next slide, Kristen, if you can. Okay, so on the 4 other drivers, here are a few points. First, on technology advances, it's important to note that this goes beyond more efficient devices and systems. What I call technologies intrinsic to efficiency, to also include technologies extrinsic to efficiency, such as advances in sensor technologies or artificial intelligence that can really help efficiency be more effective. But also renewables and storage. Other DER technology advances that can complement efficiency, but also potentially compete with efficiency. On economic conditions, with today's concerns about inflation and even possibly recession and worker shortages, we know this is an important driver for any form of investment, including efficiency. And related to this is also the demographic changes, such as population movement to warmer climates, or perhaps even the lasting impacts of the pandemic. Also want to mention social priorities as a driver. In some ways covers all the others in our consumer-driven economy. These social priorities include increased recognition of energy burden and disadvantaged underserved communities, but also societal emphasis on resilience and reliability, or personal interest in addressing environmental impacts. And for this last driver that I call potentially important, the business practices, basically we didn't find agreement on its importance from people we heard from. I think in large part that's due to the incredible level of diversity found in efficiency markets for building types, contracting types, et cetera. So perhaps, for example, one amazing business model might work for one large commercial building sector with high energy prices, but that doesn't necessarily mean that business model works for the larger efficiency world. Next slide, please. Now, for expectations for the next 10 years, we came up with two scenarios for the future to focus on the growth or of the scale of efficiency markets over the next 10 years. Of course, I want to caveat this in the next slide with the old tongue-in-cheek saying that it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. One conclusion was that while state-specific actions will vary, overall state and local governments will increase their efficiency achievements. So we do expect increases in efficiency, but will that be low or moderate or high really depends on the greenhouse gas emissions reductions that we see in regulations and policies. If they're there, we might see higher growth or expect to have lower growth. So as mentioned, a primary driver is these types of policies. Next slide, please. Here's a little more on these predictions for the future, and I'll just mention a few from this slide. Electricity efficiency actions will become more focused on demand flexibility, the time value of energy savings. And this is an important topic. It's a really important topic, and it's covered in the report for this project, as well as other Berkeley Lab and DOE reports. And then efficiency improvements for some technologies will definitely result in greater cost-effective efficiency impacts. For example, people we talk to expect changes in heat pumps for space and water heating, building energy controls, building shell components like windows. However, some caution here that for some end uses and technologies like lighting, motors, boilers, will not see the efficiency advances at the rate they've occurred in the past, given how high their efficiency levels are currently. Last one I want to note here about low-income programs. We definitely see increased investment and continuation, really a separate route from other residential and commercial programs, with a portion of the industry continuing to focus on these energy burning communities and households, with things like direct install and no-cost retrofits, such as weatherization. And there'll be increasing emphasis on the social benefits of reducing energy bills. Next slide, please. One of my expressions I try to realize as a manager is, there's known unknowns. And, I've got several of them listed here in this slide, but I'll just mention one, considering decarbonization efforts, will governments and utilities actively encourage customers to shift from using natural gas in buildings and in favor of non-fossil fuel-based technologies like heat pumps? And if so, how will that impact energy efficiency and activities in their markets? For example, will there continue to be financial support for efficient natural gas equipment retrofits and new construction? So in interest in time, I'm going to move on to the next slide if I can. And just sort of talk a little bit about the implications of this research. Really, I've been involved in this industry for several decades, I'll just say. And as in these last 40, 50 years, the building efficiency markets will continue to see significant swings in investment and uncertainty. But there's some things we can tell that's going on here. And that's that the rate of progress towards climate-related building decarbonization and the grid integration of renewables really can provide a thrust that moves us a lot forward to a lot of growth. And that will be a big determinant as we see what level of commitment there is to those policies. Because those policies and regulations are important, it's that stakeholder engagement in those that's really important. And that means you all here, it's really critical for the development of effective policies and regulations, whatever direction you want to see this go. And most importantly here, as energy transitions occur, increased support is needed for those with the heaviest energy burdens and the fewest resources to address them, through public and ratepayer efficiency investments. So I'll leave you some examples here for what members of this community can do to support that local, state, and regional and federal decision makers, really working on those intrinsic and extrinsic technology advances, developing effective building decarbonization strategies, the tariff designs to address the cost drivers, and really achieving the necessary market transformation that increases, consumer demand for sufficiency and supports an innovative efficiency industry and its labor force. So with that, I'm concluding my sort of whirlwind tour of our report. Again, much more in the document itself. And now, Kristen, if you turn to the next slide, get to the part that I've really been looking for, which is a discussion with our panelists. Each of our panelists are going to get up to 2 minutes, and I'm going to use my virtual hook here to talk about their perspectives on the future and thoughts on the report itself. And then we've got a set of questions that we're going to have discussion on. And we have these great panelists. I'm just so excited, for who they are and what they represent and the work that they do in our industry. We have Jennifer Chamberlain, who's the Executive Director of Market Development at Power. Andrew Delasky, unfortunately, has COVID and is not joining us, but I'm certainly hoping that his perspective on standards, but we're going to have to do without him. Chandra Farley, who's the CEO of Resolve, is here. Megan Gilman, our commissioner representative from Colorado. Of course, David, who you heard from. Marianne Piet, who's the director of the Berkeley Labs Building Technology and Urban Systems Division. And then Kenneth Shiver, who's the chief economist, who's taken the time to join us from the Southern Company. Then we also have our question moderator here as well, Jeff Deason, who's also with me in the Berkeley Labs Electricity Markets and Policy Department. So with that, I believe we sort of ordered it in alphabetical by last name. Jennifer, if you want to give us your initial thoughts for a minute or so here.
Sure. Thanks for having me today. I appreciate it. I found this report really interesting and appreciated perhaps that a lot of it lined up with my personal thought and worldview. I operate in kind of the demand response and energy management space, but I'm a long time energy policy person who has worked across the country, primarily representing kind of commercial and industrial customers. So that's where I come to this space from. Obviously, that takes a lot of the building efficiency, drives my customers and the customers I work with every day. So that's kind of the space that I live in. And like I said, I found this report very interesting from this perspective, where I really think that a lot of drivers, at least for customers in that space, are going to be sitting is around those rates, around integration of DERs and grid flexibility. Obviously, efficiency comes first, but efficiency, which is just kind of a standard thing, everybody in efficiency knows you should do that. So don't even need to talk about that. What you need to talk about is, what else are customers doing? And there are significant investments in DERs, significant investments in both happening and needed in ways to harness the load flexibility of buildings. A lot of that goes hand in hand with efficiency upgrades. So as we think about efficiency in buildings, and we think about retrofits, I think we really need to figure out how to harness the flexibility of the buildings at the same time. Static efficiency is important, but I think customers are really interested in what they can do to help flex their usage in terms of grid services. That's become increasingly interesting to customers, particularly as costs have risen. And so I think whenever you're looking at the perspective, that is a driver of efficiency, and I think should be one that is more frequently recognized as how those things can go hand in hand. So as we're talking to policymakers, those things I think are key drivers for us. Be mindful of time. I'll give it back to you, Steve.
Great, thank you. Chandra.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to you all for having me here today. I'm a believer in energy efficiency, so I was really excited to be invited to be a part of this panel. I recently launched an energy justice consulting practice, but my energy efficiency story starts sometime before that. I worked at South Base Energy Institute for about 8 years and led our nonprofit energy and water efficiency programs. And being able to see the power of energy efficiency to deliver real benefits that communities already overburdened by unaffordable bills, rising utility costs could really put their hands on, and then be able to deliver through energy efficiency to them more dollars, more money available to shift. So in focusing just on nonprofits, let's say working with the Boys and Girls Club, or working with a food bank and the Feeding America Network, or a Salvation Army homeless shelter, and saving them $1,000 a month. That meant, 500 additional kids they could serve, or 100,000 additional meals they could serve. And I tell this as part of my energy efficiency story particularly from an equity perspective, from an environmental justice perspective, that is about people. So I really come from the space of working with people and working with communities, and believing in energy efficiency, and knowing that it works to provide real tangible benefit for the quote unquote non-practitioner, let's say, who is critical to our ability to be able to advance a variety of things that were lifted up in this report. For me, those particular drivers were around public policy and regulation, and societal priorities, which of course I would put at very important, but they all are. And I believe that energy efficiency is going to continue to be what I like to call a workhorse for advancing equity in energy. The question will remain access. How, with all of these drivers, the question has to be who for, right? And again, coming from the people side, the residential side, the small business side, who is the market? Who is being left out of the market? So those are some key questions that go sort of a next step, I would say, for us to address as we go deeper into these 6 drivers. And particularly, some of these things came up in the report that I was a part of, organized by Lisa Schwartz, that was here, around advancing equity in utility regulation, and the disabling of energy efficiency programs and their ability to reach who they need to reach in this moment, particularly in the oppressive regulatory environment of the South. So I'll look forward to the rest of our discussion today.
Thank you, Chandra. And next we have our Commissioner Gilman.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it, and I appreciate your work. It was a great read, and great to be here with my fellow panelists. I think it goes without saying, but I'll say anyway, my thoughts today are just my own, not those of the commission, but I really appreciated the report. And, personally, I'm very bullish on our ability to create highly efficient, highly flexible, grid interactive buildings. And this provides an opportunity not only to save those occupants money and provide really more precise comfort and safety, also to rise up a lot of the equity concerns that Chandra was hitting on, but also to save the entire system money. If we look upon better ways to flex these loads and operate the grid, that can provide savings for the entire system in general. However, I think it's unreasonable to expect consumers to behave this way, if we've never told them, and if we're unwilling to compensate them for behaving in that way. So that's really the transition, is, how do we get there? I think you've provided a great list with these 6 different kind of areas and bullets. The ranking's very helpful, but I also want to caution people not to get sidetracked by the ranking if the area in which you work isn't number 1 or number 2. I think it's still all hands on deck. We all have to pull every lever we can pull to continue to work toward this vision of interactive buildings that save the occupants and the entire system money. Clearly, I agree with your premise. I think a lot of efficiency will move to areas of including a lot more grid flexibility and demand reduction to really work as assets for the system itself. And it will take a full suite of all 6 of these things, and they operate sometimes in different universes, but kind of build on top of each other to make it. So it'll be important to have all of those efforts come to bear so that we can ensure we have the policy to support this, the economics to allow people to make these decisions, especially to bring in those different equity concerns, and the technology and business practices to kind of buoy and provide this support to people to bring these technologies and these abilities to our buildings and to the grid. So excited for the rest of the conversation, and really appreciate being included. It's exciting, having spent a dozen years on the ground before I was at the commission trying to make some of this happen and working on it. You know, I'm hopeful for what technologically is out there and where we can get, but clearly it requires an entire apparatus to be sure that we're bringing all the resources we have to bear to support this industry.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I was looking at your bio and your background, and obviously we just need more and more engineers to be in those commission leadership positions like yourself there. And we'll see whether Kenneth agrees with that, the economist, on having engineers running everything. But we can get to that when we get to his time. But David, do you want to put in your 30 seconds here on your thoughts on the importance of this or your perspective on the future?
Yeah, I'm gonna just say two trite things. One is trite thing number one, all the above. Trite thing number two, what she said, where she is Jennifer and Chandra and Commissioner Gilman. And just want to underscore, I think efficiency, I've been doing it as long as you have, Steve. And I think it's changing now in this integration with variable renewables, the climate, the environmental justice. It's a different layer, and your dad's energy efficiency isn't going to do the job anymore. So just want to, again, reasonably state the obvious. That's the challenge before our community, and we're going to see if we're up to it. Thanks.
Thank you. We turn to Marianne Piet over there, standing in front of the Berkeley lab as well.
Great discussion so far. I got my watch on, so I'll keep under 2 minutes here. And so I have 4 points I want to make, but I first want to say that I did have the chance to work with Art Rosenfeld 4 decades ago at UC Berkeley, and I've been working in energy efficiency for many years, and it's a really exciting time. We did decades of work on energy efficiency, and now we're thinking about that grid integration aspect. Plus electrification, which we haven't talked about. And if we do electrification, we want that to be as efficient as possible. So we really want those heat pumps to be efficient. And so my first point is, when you do HVAC retrofits, you really care about the shell of the building. So it's a really important time to think about that shell. And I want to mention extreme heat as well as extreme cold. So when we put in the better windows and the insulation and the cool roofs, we're thinking about packages of technologies, not just those heat pump retrofits, but how do we think about how to make those retrofits cost effective and bring them to market at scale. Second point, Jennifer mentioned the prices and load flexibility. The Public Utilities Commission in California just renamed the dynamic tariff system to something called CalFuse, California Flexible Unified Signal for Energy. California Flexible Unified Signal for Energy. So there's a new activity in California where we're trying to create prices that can listen, devices that can listen to prices and publish the prices in a standard form. Energy efficiency still matters. We want to use as little energy every hour as possible, but what hours you use it matter. So we're trying to move loads, and that is really exciting. We have something called CalFlex Hub, where we're trying to partner with industry and utilities and researchers to accelerate that. My final point is around storage. Storage has to be efficient also. So when you put the energy in, you want it to get as much out, whether it's a battery or a thermal storage or the mass of the building. So energy efficiency is a foundation for all of these building technologies, and really important for the electric industry.
Push my unmute button there. Thank you, Marianne. And last but not least, Kenneth Shiver from the Southern Company. Thanks, Kenneth.
Oh, thank you. And by the way, it takes engineers and economists. We have to talk and figure it all out. So, but glad to be here today. And my role at Southern Company, I really lead the demand side planning effort at Southern Company. So everything from understanding how customers use energy, how they're going to use energy, and supporting all the cost benefit analysis that we do around looking at energy efficiency and demand response. And really just think about how do we deal with the customer demand part of the planning process. And that was really what I kind of emphasize. At the core is great, hits a lot of key things. I do think one thing we have not hit as much on today, the industry is transitioning to net zero. Now, The challenge is, I think we'd all like to go a lot faster than all of us have goals or where we're going to right now. And the big challenge of going faster is making it affordable and the amount of infrastructure investment that we require to go faster. The lever to make that better to me is energy efficiency. Because what's kind of happening with us is we're looking at transitioning our fleets to be carbon neutral or carbon net zero, whatever flavor you want to call that. Our supply side grid is getting a lot less flexible. We used to be able to turn on a combustion turbine and we had power whenever you wanted it. You got solar, which is great. You got wind, which is great, but it's variable, or it only works when the sun shines. And that has a lot more, we are losing grid flexibility on the supply side. To me, we've got to think about how do we add now demand flexibility. So that's your DER, the storage devices Marianne talked about, the demand response. There's no classic, but I think it's getting much more integrated in to make demand a lot more flexible. But it's also how to reduce load volatility, because of doing those two different things, the amount of other generation that has to be built as we transition the fleet, in addition to these things like solar and other renewables, is not as much, which means the transition is affordable, means we have to deploy less capital, which means we get there quicker. So to me, I really look at this, and I think the report hits a lot of these items, is energy efficiency is very fundamental to making the energy transition easier and more affordable to customers. And the comments that were made earlier too, just about building shells too, just that's something I'll probably hit on later. It's just, that is very fundamental to me, because there's a large part of the marketplace, especially in the low income space, that has poor building shells. If we don't deal with that, these electrification technologies are not going to be as successful as they could be without a good foundation to start from. So a great report, great work, Steve.
Hey, Ken, thank you, everybody. And you all are doing great. We are like only 2 minutes behind. I'm very impressed. It makes me want to like slow things down. No, but I'm not going to do that. We're going to turn to
Steve, was that a dare to us?
No, absolutely not. No. Talk fast. I'm going to put you on high speed playback here. So the next part that we're doing is that, we all kind of came up with some preset questions that we thought would be of interest to the audience. And so we're going to go through those. There's 5 of them. They'll mostly take us to the top of the hour. And then we're planning on responding to the degree we can, the Q&A that's come in from the audience. So the first question, I'm going to give David, because you said you're going to talk really fast, the first chance of the response, and then Chandra and Megan, if you have some other comments you want to chime in. But the question is, our report indicates that government policy and regulation will be this major driver of the future efficiency. So are new policy and regulations required? Do we see them as happening actually? There's just a 2-part question. Are they required or will they happen? And well, we need more approaches for competitive markets. Will we need to see more codes and standards, or will we need to really just rely on natural market transformation? So what do you think about this government policy and regulation being a major driver? Where's that going to go? Dave?
So, yeah. A few answers. Are they required? Of course they're required. We saw it earlier. This nation as a whole, our economy, wastes over $100 billion per annum just in energy in buildings. Forget, aside from industry and transportation, over $100 billion simply wasted due to inefficiency. So are there, and that plus the CO2 and the ambient air and the reliability impacts. So is it required? Of course it is. Is it happening? Not so clear. I think it is happening, and not just in California or Massachusetts. It's happening in other parts of the country, and not just in Washington, D.C., but it's not happening at a sufficient pace. And I'm going to commend my big boss. I'm a civil servant, but the Biden administration has pushed on a lot of fronts, the traditional methods such as appliance standards, but also new approaches such as infrastructure funding for energy efficiency. But, and what I work on virtual power plants, and we have billions of dollars in loan guarantees for virtual power plants that bring together efficiency, demand flexibility, and distributed renewables storage, but it's not up to the size of the job. So I think government needs to do more. My agency the PUCs, the states and other units of government, local governments. I think we need to do more because I don't think we're there yet. Is it going to be a market or a traditional government? Sorry, I'm going to punt on that and say all of the above. We need both, and we're going to see both to some degree or another.
Yeah, Chandra, something you want to add into that?
I agree, absolutely. Particularly when looking again back at the two of these drivers around public policy and regulation and societal priorities. And David mentioned, the infrastructure law, and, we can talk about Justice 40 as well, which is still, these things are happening slowly, but are incorporating the societal priorities, equity priorities into public policy, into regulation. And those are the kinds of drivers that we do need, that are good, that is coming, that leadership is coming from the federal government, but it's got to trickle down. If we're looking at the states, if we're looking at the agencies, the state energy offices, public service commission, as we call it in Georgia, the utilities, those things have got to start trickle down, and we've got to have more robust investment and more capacity within these offices and within these agencies, and capacity around the education around the why this is so important, and then how to actually deploy these benefits and deploy these technologies to the people on the ground. We still have a long way to go on that.
And our regulator, what do you think? Policies, regulation, where's it going?
This is a very flattering question. No, but I will just follow up by saying, so I know Kenneth had mentioned in his opening remarks that energy efficiency is really going to be a fundamental key to making the energy transition more affordable. And I think that's an important role that regulators and policymakers make in, like, we're in this every day watching, what do we think is going to happen next? What do we think is going to happen 5-10 steps down the line? And while right now some of the economics might not be clear to like individual consumers, with us being more strategic and looking down the line, I think part of the policy and regulatory job is to foresee what needs to happen, and then help demand that the market come meet that moment, and help us deliver on that, because we see these economics coming, but not all of them are apparent today, right? Some of these are 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line when we're looking at some of the help that this will give us. And so that strategy is a very helpful thing we can bring to bear in the policy and regulatory framework.
Hey, can I ask Steve real quick? Can I ask Commissioner Gilman a follow-up and just ask her, do you see, part of that's about price signals, of course, and that's what you get paid to do, is set tariffs, of course, that are just fair and forward-looking. Is some of that also about, for the role of your commission and others, about non-price signals? Is it about other government, PUC regulatory interventions that are aside from tariffs, or do you think tariffs are where the action is?
Yeah, I mean, look, tariffs are probably the most customer facing and obvious tariffs, and then like straight incentives or rebates for different activities or purchasers or things like that. But I think if you look top to bottom at the operations of our utilities, there can be from very explicit to pretty low key drivers that make things easier or harder to execute. And I think the importance will be examining those top to bottom and saying, are we doing everything we can to help execute on what we see as the most strategic and low cost and efficient way to move toward this future? So I think those are the most obvious, David, but there are probably all sorts of different policies. I mean, some of which hardly ever probably come before commissions, right? That are just kind of standard operating procedure that can make things easier or harder. And so, it's a lot. We're already all kind of overworked here in what we have going on, but in trying to understand all of the levers that we have from top to bottom, I think that would be the ideal.
Okay. Well, I'm going to move on to the next question we've come up with here. Thank you. And that's about technologies. And, are there particular technologies or energy management, demand flexibility strategies that are primed to take off? And conversely, are there strategies, technologies that have peaked? And I want to start this with the woman who runs the technology division at Berkeley Lab with Mary Ann, and then David, you run the building technology office, if you have some comments. And then Jennifer representing the entire efficiency industry there, who you get to apply this stuff. So where do you see technologies at?
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to make two comments. The first one is controls. And controls also mean data. So we're getting much better at collecting the data and using it in control. That means things like predictive controls, machine learning, and AI. And whether it's with large buildings, industry, or homes, third parties have the ability to collect data. Now, there are privacy issues, of course, but data. The second one is this concept of a connected community. So that's another program that DOE's launched. There's 10 of them around the country, and they're stacking technologies, energy efficiency, demand response and grid services, and DERs. And there's business model innovation that requires a good understanding of how these technologies can be integrated. So interoperability and control is, again, a key theme there. So I'll let others comment.
Yeah, David, you ran the technologies office. Where are we going?
Yeah, and when I ran it, I did well by listening to Mary Ann Piet. So I'll do that again today and agree with everything she just said. Software and controls are key, and I think we'll have greater growth in the coming decade than will some of the hardware. But let me also add, let me add to that, say, and again, that's what I do for a living. Virtual power plants, I think, are important, and I won't bother defining them now, except virtual power plants is a lot of efficiency, a lot of distributed resources that act like a power plant. That's not only good because it's big and because you can control them as a whole. Let's just face it, all these science and economics in the world is great, but there's human nature, and a lot of humans like two things. One, utility people like big things. That's fine. We like to make it big for utility people. Kenneth, tell me if I'm wrong. Two, right? Regular people like us are doing something else for a living. We want utilities or somebody else or government to figure this out for. So that's why I'm bullish on virtual power plants as a need. Finally, I just want to say, and again, Kenneth, I'm going to cite you. You're right. The grid will become less flexible, but we've been through this before. In the 60s, when the nuclear fleet got built, our system became much less dispatchable. It was predictable, but it wasn't dispatchable. And so what did we do? We did a lot of things, including build pumped hydro storage and then combustion turbines to add flexibility that the nuclear fleet had, dispatchability the nuclear fleet had taken away. So that's what we're going to do in the future. But this time, as you said earlier, Kenneth, I just want to say we're going to use demand side resources in addition to storage, in addition to the others, to add back that flexibility. That's already happening. We just need to keep picking up the pace. But that's a sure horse to bet on.
Jennifer, I want to hear from you, but then Kenneth, we'll give you your moment to respond, and then we'll move on to the next one.
Sure. I mean, Mary Ann, I was super glad to hear what you had to say, because it lines up very much with what we see in the field and what we think as we try and provide grid services. Controls are key. They should be a part of every single retrofit. And the fact that we have everything from home controls with smart plugs and thermostats up to, really serious building controls. That's the way all this stuff needs to go. It's how we harness the flexibility. And data is so key. Letting sure that customers have access to their data, that third parties who help integrate all this stuff have access to the data, and that it's timely and smooth and fast. I mean, those data hiccups are one of the biggest impediments to harnessing load flexibility. So I'll just share that there is a resistance to believing that loads and the movement of loads and even behind the meter DERs are really there. And without quick data and accurate data, it's really hard to prove out. If you're waiting for utility meter reads to come, 60 days in advance after they VEE things, nobody's going to trust this stuff. So to me, those are the things that are really key.
Yeah, and Steve, I want to add really quickly, I didn't really talk about communication standards and interoperability, CTA 2045, OpenADR, IEEE 2030.5. There's a variety of them, and we need to be using them. So those are important also.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'll just add in, I mean, and what Mary Ann's hitting too is, yeah, the industry historically, we've like building big things. We like economies of scale. What's in a communication center? It's economies of scale. So economists like. The thing that's interesting is though, and this is what we're trying to really start to get our head around is with flat load growth or even slightly declining load growth, even with electrification, things are getting more efficient over time. Building big plants is a lot more risky than it used to be. So thinking about how do you take advantage of customers want resiliency. They want to put a DER resource out there. You integrate that in your grid and make that part of your solution out there, which is made even more efficient with good efficiency. It's how we're having to think. And that's a lot of the dialogue we're having in the industry right now and internally is just, hey, big is great. And we need some big here and there. But quite honestly, the less risky option, the better option for customers is thinking about how we integrate a lot of smaller things. We still got to do it at the right kind of scale efficiently.
Great. Well, thank you. And this is the kind of discussion we can go on for a long time. And, you know, we've got a couple more questions I want to get to. We'll probably end up going into the speed answering mode here. But for those interested in this, I just want to say that the Berkeley Lab and the Building Technology Office of DOE have quite a few research reports and publications that get into this subject. And also, Kenneth, counter to what David said, I consider utility people to be regular people too. So let's move to our next question. You know, we found that the design
And
of
lab
utility,
people too, Steve?
I'm sorry?
And lab people too, you consider?
Yeah, I'm not going to
regular
go
people?
that far. So
Okay.
sorry.
Just checking.
So our report found that the design of government utility low-income programs will increasingly emphasize social benefits of reducing energy bills, you know, health, safety, comfort, and really the importance of addressing historic discrimination, lack of attention to energy burdened communities. Chandra, do you agree? I mean, is this really happening? Is it going to occur? So trying to let you take a first shot at that, and maybe Kenneth and Megan, from your perspectives, I want to add in something, but let's see if we can get to the other two questions as well. Thank you.
Absolutely, right. Again, energy efficiency, we know energy efficiency paired with weatherization, other DERs, have the ability to reduce the energy burden on low-income households, Black households, or Indigenous communities, which experience energy burdens 3 times that of white, wealthier households. But these strategies can, you know, reduce these burdens by as much as, you know, 25% in some cases. So the ability to, I think we used the term earlier, you know, really all hands on deck, because at the top, and again, looking at all 6 of these priorities, every single one of these has and needs a lens of equity and a thread of equity. And what we know is that when we're talking about equity, when we're talking about energy equity or utility justice, yes, reducing energy burdens by lowering bills and just the ability to stabilize energy costs is key. But that goes even further in with the ability to improve the financial stability of households by providing entrepreneurship, building new business opportunities and thriving wage job opportunities. And then you're reducing emissions and you're promoting economic development. So as a strategy and talking about energy efficiency, it employing, the number of people that employs, but we've got to make sure that the access, this is the first thing that I mentioned in the introduction, the question remains access to all of these things. When we talk about technology, who has access to that technology? What are we going to do? What are the policy priority? What are the policies that need to be set? What are the regulations that need to be set to make sure the same barriers on the old technology, where communities who are most overburdened by inequitable energy burdens, the rising utility costs, are not blocked from those opportunities. So with all of these, the question remains access. The question remains who is a part of the market, and the question remains how do we take care of who is being left out of that market.
Right, Kenneth, utility?
Those are some great comments, and I'll sort of circle in on one particular part, the discrimination aspect a little bit, because we started thinking about, as what I talked about earlier, how do we lower load volatility out there? I really got into weatherization, started thinking about what's the marketplace. Then I ran across some great work with an organization within the Southeastern Energy Efficiency Alliance. And they had actually done GIS mapping showing where the old red line districts are at, the old neighborhoods that were historically discriminated against from financing, is where most of our energy burden is at in the Southeast. And bottom line is, we don't address weatherization, getting the good foundation out there around this. From our numbers, it's 25% of our customers are low income and live in poorly insulated homes. Bringing those homes up just to kind of normal standard lowers energy burden by 1 to 2 percentage points. To me, if we don't address that fundamental, we limit the marketplace for energy efficiency to be part of the solution. So to me, this is a really key issue as we go forward. It's part of the aspect of the top drivers out there, this societal aspect here, because we can help bring these homes that are just, they're old. They never were designed well in the first place. Get them leased up to some minimum standard. We now then create the opportunity for all these other new technologies to start coming into play, and quite honestly, make all of their lives better. So that's kind of how I keep thinking about this topic on this question. It's just really, we got to make sure we do the fundamentals before we get into all the end uses.
Megan, do you have any closing comments as we try to get to our speed of the last two ones?
Absolutely, yeah. So this is something we're increasingly focusing on in Colorado. And of course, as we look at areas with significant energy burden, those can also be areas with significant health safety issues in homes, significant comfort issues in homes. So there's really a lot at stake here. And I would say we're in the very beginning stages of this, and really taking a much wider view of equity in all of our work, and kind of embarking on a lot of listening right now and learning and trying to understand how we can best be in contact with those communities. I think commissions have not always been the most user-friendly kind of forum, but understanding how we can do better outreach and really understand what's necessary and how we track success for kind of equity and inclusion going forward in the energy transition.
Thank you. So we're going to do speed answers the last couple of minutes here before we turn to the participant Q&A at the top of the hour for those on the panel who can stick around for this. The next question, I'm going to start with Megan, and then maybe have Jennifer if you want to chime in. For both of you, are there business practices, both within the private sector, but also for utility regulation, that can really drive efficiency market expansion? What do you think?
I think it depends. I know this comes on later in the list, right? It's a lower kind of priority ranking, but it depends. If we see truly innovative business models for marketing and implementing efficiency, that could be a huge game changer. I think it would have to be enabled by technology, but we could see a lot move very quickly if we see some real innovative business models coming through to help provide some of these solutions in a cost-effective way. So obviously it's part of the suite, but it could be a massive accelerant if we see something come to bear here.
I would agree with that. I think there's a lot of changes coming quickly. I think it becomes really important to let customers have access to, access to monetize their load flexibility, access to monetize their DERs. And I think that's one of the barriers we see, market models and regulatory models that allow customers working with aggregators to bring that stuff to the table, I think can move this very, very quickly. And it can get customers kind of over that hurdle and help them finance this stuff at everything from the very small to the very large customer scale. So I think the business model goes from both sides, and some of it is the regulatory regime allowing for it.
Okay. Well, thank you both. I'm going to move to our last question before we sum up this portion here. And this is something I've seen in the Q&A questions coming from our participants as well, our audience. And that's, focusing on the current economic conditions. Our report tried to look out 10 years plus. But obviously there's a lot going on. Do you think current economic conditions, inflation, tight job markets, fear of recession, what's going on with the, fossil fuel markets, with the invasion of Ukraine. Are these going to affect the efficiency markets in the long term, or is this a short-term blip? What are the implications? I forgot to mention COVID. Of what's going on that will affect efficiency next 10 years. And I'm going to start with our economists, Kenneth, and then maybe Jennifer, David, chime in, from what you see as well.
Yeah, just real quick. I think it is a short-term challenge. I mean, rising interest rates definitely going to raise the hurdles out there for doing energy efficiency in the short term. It reduces free cash flow, but long term, I mean, I think if you do take the Ukraine issues and what's going on with our energy markets, we are probably in an environment where prices are going to be higher than they were expected to be prior to all this. And sorry about that. I'm at a conference. They're going to be more expensive, and that will actually make paybacks better on energy efficiency. I think, to me, as we think about things, customers, especially if we think about climate, resiliency is going to be a bigger demand. And to me, the fundamental thing for put any resiliency solution is basically get the energy usage down as much as possible. And the price signals are going to be pushing that. It's just short term, we may have a little bit of headwind to work against.
I agree with Kenneth completely. I mean, we see that with customers today. Even with office buildings, for example, people aren't sure who's coming back. It puts a little bit of question resistance about, is now the right time, especially with money getting more expensive. But resiliency is key, and efficiency comes first when you're doing resiliency measures, because you want to make sure that you can operate as much of this stuff as possible. I don't see that going away. This might be a tricky year to get a lot of stuff done, especially with supply chains and still pandemic question marks. But I think of this as only a short to midterm issue, not at all a mid to long term issue.
Well,
I'll just say quickly, yeah, I think most of this is short term, but I think the cost of capital is sticking around, the higher cost of capital, and that'll affect efficiency, but I think it's much more going to affect capital, CapEx intensive solutions, whether they're traditional power plants or even distributed renewables. So on a competitive basis, I think efficiency may do better in a high interest environment, but we'll find out. I don't think the Ukraine issue is going to, I think the US is insulated enough from global markets.
Well, thank you all. I know we could go on for quite some time, but I'm going to turn this now over to my colleague, Jeff Deason, has a few questions from the audience. We've scheduled this webinar for 1 hour. And I guess really at my urging, after being in 3,427 Zoom calls over the last couple of years, Zoom burnout can be real, but for those of you on our panel who can stick around, appreciate that. And we do have some questions from the audience that you might want to respond to. And for those that can, again, thank you so much for participating in this. And Jeff, I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks so much, Steve. Thanks to all the panelists for lending your insight, and thanks to all the audience for sticking around. As Steve says, we're sort of in, these are bonus balls in the home run derby now, because we're beyond the noon hour here, or the 3 p.m. or 2 p.m. or whatever time it is where you are. So really appreciate those of you who are sticking around, and we'll try to answer a few questions. We're not going to get to all of them. I think we'll cap this after 15 minutes or so. So I'm just going to jump right in. And the first couple questions are questions that, essentially threaten to skewer us slightly for not being specific enough, which is great. So I'm going to ask some folks to get more specific. And the first, I'm going to go to a comment made by Allison Silverstein, which is essentially, hard to disagree with the report's conclusions, but it doesn't offer a lot of clear, specific recommendations and priorities for what or how different actors can do to overcome or leverage these drivers to move these goals forward. Can each panelist suggest 1 or 2 specific actions and why you prioritize this? So basically the ask is for each of you, pick 1 or 2 things that you really think needs doing to drive, to sort of navigate these drivers and get things moving. And I will give you maybe 2 or 3 seconds for a panelist to raise their hand and go first. If I don't see that, I'm just going to go along the line and what I see on my screen. And I'm going along the line, and that means that Jennifer's first. So 1 or 2 things that you would propose.
I would propose that markets allow, and that can be different from states, whether it's RTOs at the utility level, at a tariff level, that load flexibility be allowed to be monetized, and that those clear price signals be available I think that's pretty key in driving this and allowing efficiency to be part of that. In some places, efficiency comes off the top, but this kind of efficiency that is controlled and data driven, and that will allow loads to be moved, because we do need the load side to be flexible since the supply side is less so. You can't do that without allowing a pathway to monetizing that, whether it be from somebody like a thermostat manufacturer that's going to help work with their crews to individual large customers. There's kind of pathways all the way through. That'd be my ask.
Great. Kenneth, you're next for me.
Yeah, I'll kind of think about what I said a minute ago. I really think it's the low income weatherization issue out there. It's just a huge part of the market that it's a tough one to tackle, but if we don't tackle it, and honestly, those that aren't in the low income market space, there are so many things they should be doing energy efficiency today. It already makes sense. That's a part of the marketplace that if we don't address it from a public policy standpoint, it's not going to happen on its own. And it's bigger than just the utilities. To me, this is where you start bringing in the health side of the question, the public policy side of the question, to really say, as a society, what kind of homes do we want people living in? And I think it's better than what we've got today.
Our next audience question, we'll get into this in more detail. Megan.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, totally agree with Kenneth, especially as we look at transition, say on the gas side of things and things like that. I know there are a lot of concerns about costs and certainly looking at efficiency and prioritizing efficiency in income qualified households will be a very important part of this moving forward. And also would just second Jennifer's comment, we have to show people the economics of this. And it's hard because not all of the economics are clear today, but we think very much they'll be clear in 10 years and 15 years and 20 years. And people are building buildings for 40 years. And if we are not showing them the economics of putting in the controls and the systems and the technology that will enable them to monetize the flexibility of the building, then we missed a great opportunity for them to get it in. And so whether it's pilots or whatever it is, we have to at least show the pathway of the economics of building in these features for new buildings before we miss the opportunity.
Thank you. David.
I have two items that I think all sorts of players can contribute to, but especially governmental players. Number one is, I call it TSV-ing. What does that mean? To look at the time-sensitive value of the decisions we make and to factor it in. So what I mean by that is a kilowatt hour or a therm saved at a peak time, especially a kilowatt hour, is more valuable to society than one saved at an off-peak time. So that's not just, I'm not making a statement about tariffs, so that's certainly part of it. I'm saying everything we do at my end, our research budget should say which are the, let's put R&D into the things that save money at peak, that provide efficiency benefits that fits the most valuable. At a utility or utility commission, be looking at, are the incentives and the rebates and other interventions, are they looking at the time sensitive value? All kilowatt hours are not equal. Some are much more valuable. So that's one thing that we can, most of us can do. Number two, codes and standards. Again, I'm not speaking on behalf of the department on that issue any longer, but codes and standards can not only be more aggressive and therefore get efficiency that way in a cost-effective way, and that's particularly beneficial to a low income of folks when they are in new construction. But again, we can get to net zero energy, and we can look at the integration of whether it's EV charging or renewables. It's a great way to link efficiency with non-efficiency clean energy through modern codes and through standards. A lot of other countries are starting to do it. We can do it too when there's room for home builders, for utilities, for government. Those are my two things.
All right, and last.
So Allison, practical enough for you? All right, thanks, Jeff.
Jeff, I'm gonna see if I can. Did we get
Marianne? We still
Marianne? No,
Just I'll be super quick. One of the reasons that load flexibility isn't valued is the programs change too often. So the programs need to be in place long enough for somebody to make investments and recover them. So that's just a question about how often the DSM programs change. It's really a challenge for the industry. And then codes and standards and communication standards. You can future-proof the investment by requiring certain kinds of communication standards and interoperability. And that allows you, if something changes, the partner changes, it's still interoperable with some other business model. So I want to encourage in specifications that mention interoperability and communication standards for flexible loads.
All right, let's move to another question.
I'm gonna chime in, Jeff. I
Oh, go
can't
ahead.
help myself, sorry.
I should have listed you. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to do one big one and then two sort of specific ones. The big one is climate policy. We just need to recognize and accept, what should be an apolitical discussion about what is the best way to mitigate and now adapt to climate change. Efficiency will be a big part of that. So to me, that's, we talked about policy being a big driver. And to me, we need to just have this as a nation and as a world, to focus on addressing climate change. And I think that will be a huge driver. Some specifics, I think some of you have covered, data access. I think it's again, gets into a policy regulatory issue more than a technology issue of finding that balance between privacy, cybersecurity, and the access to the data that can really improve the performance of our buildings. And the interoperability, for example, that Mary Ann mentioned. And the last one I'll say is labor force. We need a growing labor force that can implement the kind of stuff we're talking about, to make that certainly much more, at least a living wage, if not much more so, and to help, in any transition, whether we're moving from, horse-driven carriages or to this new energy infrastructure, there are people who are going to be displaced, and that provide the opportunities for them, to be part of this new energy economy. So data, workforce, and climate policy.
All right, let's move to another question. We'll try to get maybe a couple more in if we can. And this next question goes back to the point of emphasis that several of us have made, that low-income property investments will become more important and hopefully increase in prevalence. And the real question here, and I agree with this question, is basically where does the money come from, right? So how can you fund these investments? How much contribution can you expect from the homeowners of these properties, and how much state or federal or utility support can be expected, and how do you square this circle? So maybe I will invite, I guess Chandra has had to jump off. So I saw some nods from Kenneth, and he mentioned this issue as well. I don't know if Kenneth, if you have a response to this, and then maybe we can go to Megan and then anyone else who wants to jump in.
Well, I'll throw out, that's one of the, I like conversations like this. It's definitely pulling together a lot of different people to figure out the problem, because there's no one group that can take on this. It's bigger than us. I mean, think about 25% of our customers. It's turning out another like 25% of our households are in this position. That's a lot of households to deal with. It's going to take all of us. But it was interesting to me, and this is where the public policy comments that Steve mentioned are so important around climate change. I was just doing back of the envelope numbers at our current emission rates for gas and electric customers on carbon. If you actually improve a home to normal insulation standards, the policy cost of that's $50 a ton. That's a very interesting thing from that standpoint. And then if you can look at companies, there's companies like Block Power out there that are doing things in a unregulated fashion, but trying to do some shared savings model. They've done some really good work in different communities out there. And so I just think it's going to take sort of a bit of an all the above strategy. Our company has been kind of out there talking about all the above on the supply side. It's time to kind of talk about all the above on the demand side of how do we do this. And honestly, that's why I enjoy engaging with folks like we have here on the panel today, because everybody's got a little bit of piece of the puzzle.
Great. Megan, or anyone else, anything to add on this question?
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I think looking at the problem a little bigger, I mean, clearly we have incentives, especially that would like run through commissions, come from utilities. But you'll likely face the tough choice. If we want more equity progress there, we may have to be providing larger incentives for a smaller number of customers and make less environmental progress, or you have to make the budgets bigger to go as far environmentally and meet your equity standards. And so I think we can't look at that as the only tool. We have to look at all of the tools that we have from a business perspective, from top to bottom, what are the different policies that enable or incentives, building codes, to help kind of crack that issue, because we can't address it only with utility incentive, although that's obviously one of the main tactics. But I think we have to look at all of the tools we have to bear here to improve the equity situation as we move forward with the transition.
I'm looking at who benefits here, and it's really society that benefits from this, from an equitable energy infrastructure. And so, we've always used ratepayer dollars for these low-income programs because that was available. But there are non-energy benefits, and so I look to other sources, including your basic tax-driven supported programs, that have a cost-benefit ratio, as EPA has shown, for example, in public health. And so I think all of the above, and not necessarily just relying on ratepayer dollars to have this social benefit, is a key to making this really occur in the level that it needs to occur.
All right, great, thanks. I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions before we wrap here. We got many more than that. Apologies. There's no way. I think we're not going to test people's limits too much. But the next one that I'm going to get to is actually sort of a comment, not a question, but I would like reaction to it. And this is a comment that the commenter is troubled that we don't seem to be seeing research targeting cost reduction for building retrofits. Just in the residential sector, costs are north of $25,000 to electrify a home or apartment. We need these costs to be radically lower. We need 9-figure focused research on much lower and much faster installations. So I'm interested in just general reactions to this comment. I see David raising his finger, so I'll go to David, and I'm sure maybe to Mary on second, and then anyone else who wants to jump in here.
Yeah, there is stuff going on at USDOE. If you Google U.S. Department of Energy Building, BTO, Advanced Building Construction, ABC initiative, is looking at how do we take the revolution that's happened in smart manufacturing and bring it to the built environment. Robotics, remote sensing, big data, et cetera, et cetera. So this is not just, this is to lower the cost, it's to supplement and complement the workforce and to try to bring the technology revolution to the stodgy old built environment, including retrofits. So, and there's also a global advanced building construction initiative. So take a look at those.
Marianne?
Yeah, so I appreciate Peter's question, and I saw it in the Q&A as well. We actually have very explicit work on what we're calling cost compression. And in order to do cost compression in retrofits, you have to understand where the costs now, hardware costs, software costs, labor costs. Costs in California are through the roof, and costs throughout the country. So we have supply chain issues, but we're actually doing a lot of work and a lot of data collection on trying to understand that. We believe that if we could package, like do a whole city block, bundling retrofits instead of marketing to each house, and because we know a lot of time a lot of the costs in the retrofits are running the business and actually bringing the customers in. So yes, it's an extremely important topic, and we need to collect the data and continue to work on cost compression in the current processes.
All right, great. And I'm going to do one more question, and then I'm going to we're going to close, or I'll kick back to Steve for any final comments. And this is about so much that we're talking about energy efficiency in the built environment, and so much of this ultimately comes down to a building owner or a building manager or a property manager or a property management company. And the question here is basically what types of working knowledge, bodies of working knowledge is the phrase, do these folks, property managers, building managers, property management companies, need to optimize retrofits and future energy efficiency optimization for the buildings they manage? What do the people in the buildings making these decisions really most need to move forward? And any volunteers to take this one first?
Well, I can throw in a few things, from my work and actually in the field and in doing this, which is, there's really basic stuff about like, who do I call? Who do I reach out to? But I think one in particular, beyond the normal barriers of, first cost and who to call and access to, is, knowing where they stand. The building benchmarking field is an area that I'm particularly interested in and thinking as a driver. So people understand, when they're paying $3 a square foot or $2 a square foot, is that a lot or a little? How does that compare? And where are the opportunities associated with that? So building labeling and benchmarking provides that kind of information that can help, from the homeowner to the, energy manager, of a, chain of grocery stores to understand, do they have an opportunity, as compared to, where they fit. So that's one piece of information I would add in that doesn't necessarily come up in the usual discussion.
Real quick, we need not just good job. We need not just good efficiency jobs. We need good efficiency careers, so that people get more expert as the technology becomes more sophisticated and they want to stick around.
Yeah, I'll drop into the chat the link to the building performance database, which is a national database that DOE sponsors. I agree with everything Steve said. The facility manager, the building owner needs to know what to ask for, and they need help. So the better educated the owner, the better the retrofits are. So they know what to spec. They know a spec when they see one, and they can do kind of that retrofit management. That's true for large buildings, much harder for small buildings, small commercial or res. But sharing data, if we are going to scale these retrofits, we need much more of that cost compression data and sharing retrofit results in ways where people can learn from their peers, whether it's schools or hospitals or office buildings. We need to create a lot more feedback on what works and how to hire a good contractor.
All right. In the interest of time, we're 20 minutes over. Thank you for all sticking with us for this long. Steve, would you like the microphone back to close here?
I think that everything's been said, but not everyone said it. So I'll just leave it to thank you to our panelists. Thank you for sticking around in this land of Zoom fatigue and making it an extra 20 minutes. Really appreciate the input and taking the time. I hope our audience, many of you stuck around, will be the recording, found this informative. And take care, everyone. Be well, take care of each other, and let's go be efficient. Thank you.
Thank you all.